Most people know Esther only as the beautiful and courageous queen who saved her people. But what few realize is that this story hides deep truths, bold strategies, and a divine purpose unfolding behind the scenes. The Book of Esther is unique. In the Bible, it never explicitly mentions God, yet his hand is visible in every detail. Behind grand banquets, deadly decrees, and political twists lies a lesson that few understand. Nothing happens by chance. Imagine being a young orphan, growing up in an empire where your identity could cost you your life. Then, without warning, being taken to the royal palace and chosen for a throne you never sought. Esther wasn't just beautiful, she was a strategist, fearless and profoundly wise. Her secret: she knew something that no one else did. The right. Courage at the right time can change the destiny of a nation, but it wasn't easy. She was surrounded by conspiracies, genocidal plans, and life-or-death decisions. And the most astonishing part? This story isn't just about the past. It reveals principles that can transform your life today. Esther didn't wait for perfect circumstances. She understood that her calling was tied to the position God had placed her in. And what if I told you that you, too, might be in a strategic place for something greater than you imagine? It's time to uncover the truth that few people know about Queen Esther. Esther never imagined that her life would take such an extraordinary turn. Orphaned from childhood, she was raised by her cousin Mordecai, a man devoted to God and full of wisdom. As she grew up, she found herself in a foreign culture, in a land where the Jews were a minority. Her story seemed destined for simplicity, but fate had something grand in store for her. The truth is, those who are forgotten by the world are often the ones God chooses to write the most impactful chapters in history. Esther was one of these people, and her name would soon echo through the halls of power. Esther's beauty was not just external. Her grace and humility captivated everyone around her, but what few realized was that her true strength lay in her faith and courage. While many might have been consumed by the luxury and vanity of palace life, Esther remained steadfast in her identity and purpose. Beauty may open doors, but character determines who enters and stays. What she did not yet know was that her life was about to change drastically, and that this simple Jewish girl would become a key figure in the fate of God's people. King Ahasuerus, in search of a new queen after Vashti's disobedience, ordered the most beautiful young women from the empire to be brought to the palace for a rigorous selection process. It wasn't just about appearance. The new queen needed to possess grace and wisdom to hold such a position. Esther, though she had never sought this honor, found favor in the eyes of everyone. Imagine the impact of a simple young woman being taken to the royal palace, undergoing an intense preparation period before being presented to the king. Her secret? She relied not only on her beauty, but on a greater truth guiding her steps. The decisive moment arrived. Esther was chosen as the Queen of Persia. But unlike what one might expect, this position did not bring her only honor and privileges. What came next would require something much greater than just a royal title. Fate had placed her in a power struggle she could never have foreseen, and her decisions would determine the future of God's people. The palace, full of intrigues and hidden agendas, was not a safe place. And soon, Esther would discover that her new position carried a purpose far beyond herself. King Ahasuerus was no ordinary ruler. He commanded a vast and powerful empire where luxury and extravagance were the norm. To display his wealth and grandeur, he organized a magnificent banquet that lasted 180 days. Yes, 6 whole months of feasting, followed by an additional 7 days of intense celebration. It was a spectacle of excess, where the kingdom's elite gathered to witness the king's splendor. But what began as a display of opulence would soon turn into the first act of a dramatic twist that would change history. In that atmosphere of indulgence and drunkenness, fate began to move its pieces. At the height of the feast, Ahasuerus made a rash decision. He ordered his wife, Queen Vashti, to appear before the guests to showcase her beauty. To him, it was a natural gesture, a demonstration of power and triumph. After all, what king wouldn't want to flaunt a queen worthy of his glory? However, Vashti refused. Just like that. She defied the command of the most powerful man in the empire. Her refusal was not just a personal act of defiance, it was a political earthquake. In a world where the king's word was law, the queen's disobedience set a dangerous precedent. The king's advisors quickly realized that this action could inspire other women to rebel against their husbands. What was to be done? The verdict was swift and severe. Vashti was deposed. The queen, who once enjoyed prestige and privilege, was now stripped of her title, cast aside, and erased from the records of power. The king's pride had been wounded, and his decision was final. But what many did not realize was that at that very moment, a space was being created for something far greater. A silent story was beginning to unfold, guided by the unseen hand of God. In the void left by Vashti's downfall, a new queen would be chosen. But this time, it would not be just a woman of great beauty, but someone with a divine mission. The palace now faced a new question. Who would take the queen's place? Ahasuerus' advisors suggested a contest where the most beautiful young women of the empire would be brought in for selection. But this search was about more than just looks. What was at stake was something far greater than a royal title. Among the thousands of young women taken to the palace, one would stand out. Esther was about to enter the scene, unaware that her journey would lead her to immense power and a purpose that would define the future of an entire nation. With Vashti's fall, the Persian Empire found itself at an unusual crossroads. A new queen needed to be chosen. And as with every grand event of that time, the selection would not be done in just any manner. The king ordered the most beautiful and noble young women from all the provinces to be brought in for a rigorous selection process. But look, this wasn't just a beauty pageant. The palace wasn't looking for just a pretty face, but for someone who could captivate, who possessed grace, wisdom, and a unique spirit. Among these young women was Esther, a Jewish girl who, until that moment, was an absolute nobody in the vast empire. Upon entering the palace, Esther found herself in a world where every detail was meticulously planned. For an entire year, the candidates underwent beauty treatments, purification rituals, and royal etiquette training. Imagine going from total anonymity to a place where every step, every gesture, and every word was scrutinized. Yet, Esther didn't just stand out. She won the favor of everyone around her. Her beauty was undeniable, but there was something more, an essence that went beyond appearance. While others competed for attention, Esther captivated naturally. Hegai, the official in charge of the royal harem, quickly noticed this and treated her with special favor, giving her the best care and opportunities. When the time came for her to be presented to the king, Esther did not rely on extravagance. Unlike the others who sought to impress with lavish garments and dazzling jewelry, she trusted Hegai's advice and chose a refined simplicity. And that made all the difference. Ahasuerus, used to seeing women trying to dazzle him, found something in Esther that went beyond the obvious. Was it love at first sight? Perhaps. But the fact remains that as soon as he saw her, the king had no doubts. Esther would be his new queen. She was crowned, and a simple Jewish girl had become the most powerful woman in the Persian Empire. However, her true mission was yet to be revealed. What few knew was that Esther kept her Jewish identity. a secret as instructed by Mordecai. Her rise to the throne wasn't just a matter of luck or coincidence. There was a divine purpose behind every detail. While many saw only a new queen, God was positioning a key piece in the grand design of history. Little did Esther know that soon the fate of all the Jewish people would depend on her courage and discernment. And as she adjusted to the luxury and grandeur of royalty, a dark shadow was beginning to form behind the scenes of the palace. While Esther enjoyed her position as queen, another man was gaining increasing influence in the empire, Haman, a high-ranking official who had become the king's right-hand man. Ambitious and cunning, he sought not only power, but also absolute recognition. His thirst for honor was so excessive that he demanded everyone bow before him. However, there was one man who refused to do so: Mordecai, Esther's cousin. Mordecai would not bow to a man who embodied arrogance and wickedness. To him, only God deserved such honor. And that unwavering stance ignited a deep hatred in Haman. Mordecai's refusal didn't just bruise Haman's ego, it planted in him an insatiable thirst for revenge. But instead of retaliating against just Mordecai, Haman decided to aim for something far greater: the complete annihilation of the Jewish people. After all, if one Jew dared to defy him, what guarantee was there that others wouldn't do the same? Fueled by this hatred, he devised a plan to wipe out all Jews in the empire. But Haman wasn't foolish. He knew he needed the king's approval for something so drastic. So, using deceptive words, he presented his proposal to Ahasuerus, twisting the facts. He made it seem as though the Jews were a threat to the empire. The king, without much thought, gave Haman full authority. Thus, an official decree was issued, ordering that on a specific day, all Jews, men, women, and children, be killed and their belongings seized. The news spread quickly, plunging the Jewish community into despair. Imagine the anguish. Innocent people living their everyday lives, suddenly condemned to death without reason. Mordecai, upon hearing the decree, tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, mourning publicly throughout the city. Haman's scheme seemed foolproof. With the king's seal in his hands, he believed his plan was unstoppable. But what he did not realize was that the queen who now sat on the throne was, in fact, a Jew. Fate had placed Esther in the right place at the right time. However, her position alone wouldn't be enough to reverse the decree. The danger was real, and time was against her. Any misstep could cost her life. Would she have the courage to intervene? Mordecai, from outside the palace, knew that the solution to this crisis rested on one difficult choice. And at that moment, Esther's role as queen was about to be truly tested. While many bowed before Haman out of fear or convenience, Mordecai stood firm. To him, there was no honor in kneeling before a man whose heart was filled with arrogance and wickedness. His loyalty was to the truth, to faith, and to the God of Israel. But his stance wasn't just an act of personal defiance. It was a living testimony that the identity of God's people could not be erased. Imagine the impact of this act: one single man in the middle of a vast empire defying the orders of a high-ranking official. His courage did not stem from recklessness, but from an unshakable conviction that faithfulness to God was worth more than human approval. Mordecai's refusal did not go unnoticed. Haman, consumed by rage, decided he would not only take revenge on Mordecai, but also exterminate the entire Jewish nation. The decree of destruction had already been signed by the king, and the day of slaughter was fast approaching. But while many were overwhelmed by despair, Mordecai saw beyond the chaos. He knew that God always provides a way of escape for his people, even when the situation seems hopeless. So he made a crucial decision. He sent a message to Esther. Not only did he inform her of the impending danger, but he challenged her to take action. The fate of the Jews could be in her hands, but would she risk her life to intervene? Mordecai's words were direct and impactful. He reminded Esther that even as queen, she was not safe from the decree. Then he asked the question that would change everything. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? That statement struck like a divine calling. This was no longer just a political issue, it was a call to fulfill a greater purpose. Esther had two choices: stay silent and protect herself, or step up and fight for her people. Mordecai didn't just point out the problem, he showed that the solution was already within her reach. She had not been made queen by accident. Now, Esther had to decide. Mordecai planted the seed of courage, but it was up to her to water it with action. Time was running out, and every moment lost brought the Jews closer to destruction. But before she could stand against the royal decree, she knew she needed something greater than human strategy. She needed divine direction. And so, a new phase was about to begin, and Esther was on the verge of making a decision that would change history forever. Esther knew she couldn't make an impulsive decision. In the Persian Empire, approaching the king without being summoned was a death sentence. Anyone who did so could be executed unless the king extended his scepter as a sign of mercy. In other words, Esther was risking not only her position, but her very life. However, given the gravity of the situation, there was no room for hesitation. She realized that her coronation was no accident. This was the moment she had been placed in the palace for. But before taking action, she made a crucial decision. She called for a 3-day fast, asking all the Jews to pray for her. She would not rely on her beauty, influence, or persuasion. She would rely on the power of God. Esther's request for the Jewish people to fast with her showed her deep understanding of spiritual battles. She knew this wasn't just about human decrees, but about forces greater than what the eye could see. How often do we face impossible challenges and try to solve them with only human effort? Esther teaches us that before making major decisions, we must seek divine guidance. Her fast was an act of total dependence on God. She was surrendering her fate into His hands, trusting that He would open a path where there was none. After 3 days of spiritual preparation, she was ready to face the unknown. With unwavering courage, Esther put on her royal robes and stepped into the presence of King Ahasuerus. The silence in the palace was deafening. All eyes turned to her, for they knew the risk she was taking. The king could order her death at any moment, but something extraordinary happened. Ahasuerus extended the golden scepter toward her. The queen had found favor in his eyes. This was a clear sign that God was orchestrating the situation. Instead of making her request immediately, Esther acted with wisdom and strategy. She invited the king and Haman to a private banquet. This decision showed that besides being brave, she was also shrewd. She didn't rush. She prepared the stage to reveal her true intentions. The invitation left Haman feeling even more convinced of his position of power. Little did he know that he was walking straight into his own downfall. Esther, on the other hand, was waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. The battle was far from over, but a new chapter in this story was about to unfold. The next day, at a table filled with luxury and power, the fate of an entire people would begin to change. Esther couldn't simply rush in and beg for mercy. To overturn a royal decree, she needed more than just emotional words. It would take strategy, precision, and wisdom to handle the situation correctly. That's why, instead of immediately revealing the truth, she organized an exclusive banquet for Ahasuerus and Haman. The invitation alone sparked the king's curiosity and inflated Haman's ego even more. After all, being invited to a private dinner with the royal couple was an extraordinary honor, but Esther knew exactly what she was doing. She was playing the game with intelligence, without haste, without recklessness. At the first banquet, the king intrigued, asked Esther what she truly wanted. This was her moment to expose the threat against her people. But once again, Esther surprised everyone by delaying her request and inviting them to a second banquet. But why? The truth is, she understood the power of timing. An impulsive decision could ruin everything. Like a wise queen, she realized that she needed to prepare the ground, win the king's full attention, and ensure that he was completely ready to listen. In the political chess game, Esther was making masterful moves. The king grew more curious, and Haman became more self-assured, without suspecting what was coming. Meanwhile, Haman's arrogance was growing by the second. He left the banquet feeling victorious, convinced that his position was more secure than ever. But when he saw Mordecai still refusing to bow, his rage reached its peak. He decided that he wouldn't wait any longer to eliminate him. That very night, he ordered the construction of a gallows 75 feet high and planned to ask the king for permission to have Mordecai hanged the next morning. Haman believed his triumph was sealed, but he had no idea that his fate had already been sealed. Behind the scenes of history, the plot was unfolding perfectly, and the second banquet would be the stage for his ultimate downfall. The next day, the king, now even more eager to know Esther's request, attended the second banquet. The moment had arrived, and the queen knew. It was finally time to reveal the whole truth. Haman, sitting at the table, had no idea that his doom was just moments away. With wisdom and determination, Esther was about to open the king's eyes to the betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight. The moment of revelation had come, and the greatest plot twist of this story was about to take place. The second banquet was unlike any other. It wasn't just a feast, it was the setting where the truth would finally come to light. The king, eager and intrigued, once again asked Esther what her true request was. This time she did not delay. With courage and wisdom, Esther revealed her Jewish identity and exposed Haman's evil plot. Imagine the impact of that revelation. The king, who admired his queen so deeply, now realized that one of his most trusted officials had orchestrated a plot to kill her and her entire people. This was an unimaginable twist. The silence in the hall was broken only by the shock that filled the air. The king, furious, stood up abruptly and left to process what he had just heard. He had signed the decree without knowing Haman's true intentions. Now he felt deceived, betrayed, and manipulated. Meanwhile, Haman, realizing that his life was hanging by a thread, threw himself at Esther's feet, begging for mercy. But ironically, this act sealed his fate. When Ahasuerus returned and saw Haman fallen at Esther's side, he interpreted it as an assault on the queen right there in the palace. That was the final straw. The king didn't need to hear another word. Haman had just signed his own death sentence. The guards were immediately summoned, and one of the royal officials informed the king of a cruelly ironic detail. Haman had built a gallows to hang Mordecai. The king, still filled with rage, gave a swift command. Haman would be hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The king, still filled with rage, gave a swift command. Haman would be hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. His ambition, his obsession with power, and his hatred had led him straight to his own demise. That same day, the man who had planned Mordecai's death met his own end in the most humiliating way possible. Justice had been served. However, one problem remained. The decree of destruction was still in effect. Persian law could not simply be undone. The Jewish people were still under threat, and a new strategy needed to be devised. The king now stood in full support of Esther and Mordecai, but how could they stop the impending disaster? A solution had to be found quickly, and time was running out. Haman's downfall brought relief, but not security. The problem was not yet solved. The royal decree that ordered the annihilation of the Jews was still in effect. This was because, according to Persian law, a decree signed with the king's seal could not simply be revoked. In other words, the death sentence was still standing, and the day of the massacre was approaching quickly. Esther and Mordecai knew that defeating Haman wasn't enough. They had to ensure their people's survival. King Ahasuerus was now inclined to help them, but what could be done? How could they prevent the catastrophe from happening? Esther once again approached the king, this time without fear. She had already risked her life once and knew she had to continue fighting. With courage, she pleaded for a new decree that would counter the effects of the first one. The king, recognizing the mistake he had made by trusting Haman, handed Mordecai his royal signet ring, the symbol of absolute authority, and granted him the power to draft a new decree. Mordecai then wrote an order allowing the Jews to defend themselves against any attack in all provinces of the empire. Now, instead of being helpless victims, they were authorized to fight back and protect their families. The news of this new decree spread quickly. The Jews, who had been drowning in despair, now found new hope and strength. But something even more extraordinary happened. The fear of God spread throughout the empire, and many Persians chose to align themselves with the Jews, realizing that a greater power was at work. The tables had completely turned. The very people who had been marked for destruction now stood prepared for battle, with the king's approval. Mordecai's influence grew, and his status in the palace became even more powerful. The Jewish exile, once marked by uncertainty and oppression, now became a testimony of divine intervention. The day of the attack arrived, but instead of being massacred, the Jews achieved victory over their enemies. Those who had expected an easy slaughter were now the ones who fell, and those who had plotted against God's people were utterly defeated. The Persian Empire had never seen anything like it. The reversal of fate was so powerful that, even within the government itself, many came to respect and admire the Jewish people. But this victory could not be forgotten. The people of God had to remember this great deliverance forever. And so, a new chapter was about to be written. The establishment of the festival of Purim was about to begin. The Jews' victory over their enemies was not just a significant event. It was a turning point in their history. The miraculous deliverance they had received could not be forgotten. So, Mordecai and Esther made a decision that would mark Jewish tradition forever. They instituted the festival of Purim, an annual celebration to remember how God worked behind the scenes to save his people. This would not be just another holiday, but a living memorial of how evil never prevails against those who trust in the Lord. The name Purim comes from the Persian word pur, meaning lots, referring to the lottery Haman had cast to determine the day of the Jews' destruction. But here's the irony. The day that was meant for their annihilation became a day of joy and celebration. What was meant for mourning turned into a feast, and what was meant for sorrow became a song of victory. The Jewish people now had a tradition that would be passed down for generations, reminding them that no evil plan can succeed against those who belong to God. And even today, thousands of years later, Jews around the world continue to celebrate Purim with joy, gratitude, and festivity. During Purim, it is customary for families to come together to read the Book of Esther, recounting the details of this incredible deliverance. It is also traditional to exchange gifts of food, help those in need, and enjoy festive banquets. The holiday is marked by joy, unity, and a deep recognition of divine faithfulness. It is a reminder that God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Esther was just a young woman, and Mordecai was just an exiled Jew, but together they changed the destiny of an entire nation. This teaches us that no matter where we are or who we are, when we place ourselves in God's hands, He can use us in unimaginable ways. But the story of Esther does not end with a celebration. The impact of her courage and faith continued for years. Mordecai, once just an unknown Jew, was exalted to become the second most powerful man in the empire, using his position to ensure the well-being of his people. What once seemed impossible became reality. And the great lesson of this story is clear. Nothing happens by chance when it comes to God's plans. Even when he seems silent, he is working. And what happened with Esther leads us to a crucial question. Could it be that we too have been placed in certain positions for such a time as this? Mordecai, who was once just an exiled Jew, went from being an ordinary man to one of the most influential figures in the Persian Empire. His faithfulness to God and his courage in refusing to bow before Haman not only preserved his life, but elevated him to a position of great authority. After Haman's fall, King Ahasuerus acknowledged Mordecai's loyalty and appointed him as Prime Minister, a role previously held by Haman. Notice the divine irony here. The man who was marked for death was exalted, while the one who planned his downfall was destroyed. This shows how God turns situations around and honors those who remain faithful. But Mordecai did not use his position for personal gain. He became a wise and just leader, working for the good of the Jewish people. Unlike Haman, who sought power for selfish reasons, Mordecai understood that influence should serve a greater purpose. He established decrees that ensured peace and prosperity for the Jews across the empire. His presence in the government brought stability, security, and justice for those who had once lived in fear. This teaches us that true leadership is not about ruling over others, but about serving and protecting those who depend on us. Power in the wrong hands is destructive, but when given to the right people, it becomes a tool for transformation. Mordecai's legacy did not end with his lifetime. His name was recorded in history as one of the great biblical heroes. Not just someone who survived a crisis, but someone who became an instrument of divine justice. Like Joseph in Egypt and Daniel in Babylon, Mordecai proves that God can elevate his people even within oppressive systems. This makes us reflect. How often does God place us in strategic positions, yet we fail to recognize it? Sometimes the struggles we face today are merely preparing us for something greater tomorrow. The key is to trust in God's plan, even when it seems unclear. The story of Esther and Mordecai is not just about a people being saved, it's about how God uses unexpected circumstances to fulfill his will. When all seemed lost, a reversal came. When the enemy seemed victorious, justice prevailed. This story is proof that God is never absent, even when we don't see him working. But the real question is, are we ready to recognize the moments when we are called to something greater? What happened to Mordecai teaches us that faithfulness is always rewarded, and those who trust in God are never forgotten. If there's one lesson we can learn from Esther's story, it's that no one is where they are by accident. You may not see it now, but every challenge, every opportunity, and every decision you face is part of a greater purpose. Esther could have remained silent. She could have chosen to stay safe. But instead, she took action, and that changed the fate of an entire nation. Now ask yourself, what are you doing with the opportunities God has placed before you? Are you living in fear, or are you stepping forward with courage and faith? The Book of Esther shows us that God is working even when he seems silent. How many times have you doubted whether he is really in control? Believe me, the fact that you are here reading this right now is no coincidence. Maybe you too have been placed in a position for such a time as this. But are you willing to take that step? Are you prepared to be a vessel in God's hands, just as Esther and Mordecai were? Now I want to hear from you. What part of Esther's story impacted you the most? Have you ever felt like you were exactly where you needed to be at the right time? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could inspire others to recognize God's purpose in their own lives. And of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll find deep biblical truths that few people talk about. Let's learn, grow, and discover together what God has in store for us.